Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fundamental issue, something that shapes the world around us in countless ways, often invisibly. It's this idea of the default male. You've shared a fascinating array of sources, and we're going to unpack how basing our data, our perspective, largely on men, has led to a world that isn't really well-designed optimally or even safely for everyone.
Exactly. And you're keen to get straight to the heart of complex matters, right? That's precisely what we aim to do. We'll navigate your sources, pinpoint the crucial insights, uncover some, genuinely surprising facts without getting bogged down. The
Good.
key thing to keep in mind, really from the start, is that when design or understanding is based on a limited data set, well, even approaches that seem totally neutral can end up having disproportionately negative consequences for those outside that default.
Okay, yeah, let's get into the foundation of this then. One of the most compelling points I thought in the material is that this isn't usually about intentional discrimination.
Not usually, no.
It's more about a deeply rooted way of thinking, a kind of historical oversight, you could say, stretching back millennia. I mean, think all the way back to Aristotle.
Right. Way.
Way back in the 4th century BC. He basically considered the female form a deviation from the male type. A natural occurrence, sure, but still a departure from the standard. So this notion that human often defaults to man, it's been with us for a very, very long time.
And what's striking is how this, ancient perspective has very tangible, sometimes deadly consequences right now in the modern world. Your sources offer some really stark examples.
By car safety.
Exactly. Take car safety. Historically, crash tests. They predominantly use dummies representing the average male.
Right, the standard crash test dummy we sort of picture.
Consequently, safety features weren't really engineered to adequately account for women's different body sizes, different physical characteristics. And the core insight here isn't just about size differences, it's that failing to consider diverse data in design leads to actual tangible harm for those who don't fit the default.
And this has contributed to women being, what was it? Significantly more likely to sustain serious injuries in car accidents.
That's the finding, yes.
Yes.
Significantly more likely.
Wow. And it's not just physical safety in obvious situations like car crashes, is it? The sources also highlight these life-threatening implications in healthcare.
Oh, definitely. Think about heart attacks.
Okay.
We often have this image, maybe from movies, of chest pain radiating down the left arm.
Yeah.
That's the classic symptom.
Yeah, the Hollywood heart attack.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But for women, heart attack symptoms can manifest very differently. Things like stomach pain, shortness of breath, nausea, fatigue.
Things you might not immediately connect to a heart attack.
Precisely. And because medical understanding has historically been centered on male symptoms, women's very real heart attacks are sometimes dismissed as atypical.
Atypical. Even though they might be typical for women.
Exactly. Which leads to delays in diagnosis, delays in treatment, and tragically higher rates of misdiagnosis and even death.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, these initial examples really underscore the central issue, don't they?
They absolutely do. When our data and our perspectives are skewed towards one group, we risk creating a world that actively disadvantages others, often in profound and sometimes quite unexpected ways.
So this default male idea isn't just a historical footnote. It's woven into the fabric of our society, starting with something as basic as language.
Yes, the sources discuss how language itself can really reinforce this male-centric viewpoint.
How so?
Well, take the word man. It's often used ambiguously, isn't it? Sometimes it refers to males specifically, sometimes supposedly to all of humanity.
Right, mankind.
Exactly. And this raises an important point about our unconscious assumptions. As the anthropologist Shirley Ardner pointed out, sometimes referred to as slocum in your sources, this ambiguous use can lead to a real blurring in our minds. Man, as the species becomes interchangeable with males.
So even researchers, like anthropologists, might unintentionally interpret data through this male lens just because of the language they're using.
It's a real risk. The language carries underlying assumptions.
And the impact of this generic masculine is surprisingly widespread. The sources detail how using masculine-coded language, even when it's intended to be inclusive, it actually skews how we see things.
It does. People are more likely to remember famous men, for example, or to think of certain professions as male-dominated.
Even favor male candidates for jobs.
Yes, that too. And it's interesting how deeply ingrained this is. Women themselves are apparently less likely to apply for jobs advertised using the generic masculine.
Really? And they perform less well in interviews for those roles, too.
That's what the research suggests. It's as if the language subtly signals, this isn't really a space for you.
Wow. And it can even override stereotypes. The sources mention something about beauticians.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Professions typically seen as female, like beautician, can suddenly be perceived as male when referred to with masculine generic language. It's quite powerful.
It could even affect scientific studies, couldn't it? Like, self-report questionnaires using the generic masculine might influence women's responses.
Potentially creating unreal differences between women and men in the data. It's as if the language itself is introducing a bias that wasn't there initially.
Which just highlights how crucial careful attention to language is in research, right?
Absolutely. If our tools themselves are subtly biased, the conclusions we draw might be flawed from the get-go.
Now, while formal English is perhaps moving away from the generic masculine, the sources point out its subtle comeback in informal language.
Like dude and guys in America.
Or lads in the UK, used as supposedly gender-neutral terms.
Right. And suggesting alternatives isn't always welcomed, is it?
No. Remember the strong reaction Danny Cotton got? The first female head of London's fire brigade.
For suggesting firefighter instead of fireman, yes, I do.
It really shows how attached some people are to this male default, even in professions.
What's notable about that firefighter example is the sheer intensity of the reaction. It underscores how even seemingly small shifts in language can be perceived as a real challenge to a long-established norm.
And it's not just old-fashioned terms. The sources highlight a seemingly modern example, emoji.
Ah, yes, emoji, the fastest-growing language, heavily used by women.
Yet surprisingly male-dominated until relatively recently.
It's a really insightful point. Emoji originated in Japan, hugely popular, especially with women. Yet the initial set leaned heavily towards male representations.
How was that?
It was largely down to the Unicode Consortium, the group that decides which emojis make it onto our phones. Until 2016, many professions, activities, they were represented by male figures by default.
So it took deliberate effort to change that.
It did. Deliberate effort and advocacy to push for more diverse and gender-neutral options.
Okay, so moving beyond language. This default male perspective also significantly impacts how men and women are shown in media and education, shapes our understanding of the world from a young age.
Definitely. The sources reveal a persistent imbalance in news media. Women consistently make up only a small percentage, around 24% of the people we hear about, read about, or see.
Only 24%, that's quite low.
It is. And this lack of representation contributes to the invisibility of women's experiences and perspectives in public conversations. If women's voices in stories aren't being heard, they're less likely to be seen as relevant or important.
And it's even more pronounced in school textbooks, isn't it?
Oh, significantly. Across decades, across multiple countries, Germany, the U.S., Australia, Spain, loads of others.
What did the studies find?
A significant overrepresentation of men. In example sentences, in pictures, even the names listed in the index.
There was that U.S. history textbook study with the picture ratio.
Yes, astonishing. 18 pictures of named men for every 100 pictures of named women.
18 to 100. That can't be right. Was it 18 women to 100 men, or... Let me check. Okay, the original script said 18 pictures of named men for every 100 pictures of named women, which seems reversed. The source Invisible Women actually cites studies like one by Sadker and Sadker showing boys appearing 1.6 times more often than girls in textbook pictures, and men outnumbering women 3.1 in title central roles, and another study where U.S. history texts had men pictured 11 times more often than women. Let's rephrase based on the general findings rather than that specific potentially confusing ratio.
Okay, right. So the general picture is men vastly outnumbering women in illustrations, often by huge margins depending on the study and the subject.
Okay, that makes more sense. And in political science textbooks.
References to women average barely 10% of the pages. And this isn't just a Western thing. Similar imbalances were found in textbooks from Armenia, Malawi, Pakistan, Taiwan, South Africa, Russia.
This is widespread, and the impact.
Well, textbooks play a crucial role, don't they? In shaping children's understanding of history, society, what's considered normal or important. When one gender is consistently overrepresented, it sends a powerful message about who matters and whose contributions are valued.
This heroes are male by default idea. It extends to other media too, like gaming.
Right. The sources mentioned Fallout 4. It was easy to switch between male and female playable characters, technically.
But the promotion defaulted back to the male version.
Almost immediately, yes. It just reinforces this idea. The male experience is the standard, the universal one, while the female experience is somehow secondary or niche.
That distinction seems key, doesn't it? The male experience is seen as the human experience, while the female perspective is a specific category.
Exactly. It's why, as the sources noted, a course titled White Male Writers at Georgetown University caused such a stir.
Whereas courses on female writers are common and pass without comment.
Precisely. The male perspective is implicitly seen as encompassing the human experience, while the female perspective is seen as this specific, limited category.
This pervasive male default has also led to the exclusion of women from positions of power and, consequently, from history itself. The Bank of England banknote example is a perfect illustration.
Ah, yes, the banknotes. Their criteria seemed objective, didn't they?
On the surface, yeah. Broad recognition, good artwork potential, no controversy, lasting and universally recognized contribution.
But they ended up with an all-male lineup initially.
Why? How did objective criteria lead there?
Well, what's fascinating is how those seemingly objective criteria are actually deeply influenced by the historical gender data gap.
Meaning?
Because women's contributions have often been overlooked, unrecorded, or even attributed to men throughout history, they are simply less likely to meet these objective benchmarks.
So it's not necessarily deliberate exclusion.
Not necessarily. More a consequence of a system built on incomplete and biased historical data. The data gap meant fewer women could meet the criteria.
Which connects to those ongoing debates about what counts as important history, like that battle over the UK history curriculum in 2013 mentioned in the sources.
And it also ties into the backlash against focusing on specific identities, what gets called identity politics.
Right, the argument that focusing on diversity neglects broader issues. The sources mention Mark Lilla's NYT article making that case.
It's important to acknowledge the different perspectives here. While some argue, like Lilla, that focusing on specific identities can fragment our understanding of broader societal issues.
Others contend that addressing historical exclusion and underrepresentation is actually essential for a more complete and accurate understanding of the past and the present.
Exactly, two very different viewpoints on how to approach history and social analysis.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The impact of this default male thinking extends beyond these maybe more abstract areas into the very tangible design of our physical world. Urban planning, transportation.
Yes, the sources provide some really eye-opening examples here. How a male-centric approach can lead to inefficiencies, even dangers, for women.
The snow clearing example in Stockholm was striking.
It really was. Additionally, the priority was clearing main roads first, for cars. Made sense on the surface. But data show that pedestrian injuries, particularly among women, actually spiked after snowfall.
Why women specifically?
Because women, on average, have different travel patterns. They rely more on walking, public transport, cycling, often making shorter, multi-stop trips, trip chaining, frequently linked to childcare or other caregiving responsibilities.
And the initial snow clearing strategy just didn't account for that pattern?
Not effectively, no.
Yeah.
Pedestrian walkways and cycle paths weren't the first priority.
But it's interesting how Stockholm later adapted, right?
Yes. They collected the data, saw the problem, and invested in dedicated machines for clearing cycle and pedestrian lanes first, or at the same time as roads.
And the result?
A 50% reduction in accidents during winter conditions. It shows that when you actually consider diverse needs and collect the right data, you can create much more effective solutions for everyone.
It also highlights how government spending priorities can reflect this bias, too.
Absolutely. The sources point to the UK as an example. Consistent austerity rhetoric, yet lavish spending on road-building projects.
Which tend to benefit car drivers, more often men.
While at the same time, funding for buses, which are used disproportionately more by women, especially for those essential shorter trips, has often been cut.
Suggests a prioritization of transport modes more frequently used by men.
That's the implication, yes.
But there are positive examples, too. Urban planning that does consider women's travel patterns.
Thankfully, yes. Barcelona's superblocks are mentioned. They prioritize pedestrians and cyclists, creating more walkable neighborhoods.
And London's hopper fare.
Right, the hopper fare on buses. It benefits people making multiple short trips within an hour, which, as we said, is a common pattern for women who are often trip chaining for various errands and caregiving tasks.
Remind us what trip chaining means again.
It just means linking several short journeys together in one outing, like drop kids at school, go to a part-time job, pick up groceries, pick up kids, that kind of thing.
Got it. So the hopper fare helps because they don't pay a new full fare for each leg of that chain.
Exactly. It directly addresses the fact that women, as the majority of bus users who often need to transfer or make multiple stops were disproportionately penalized by the old fare system, where you paid for each separate journey.
In contrast, the sources highlight U.S. cities that still charge for public transport transfers.
Which disproportionately impacts women for the same reasons. There was that study in Chicago comparing Uber pool with public transport.
What did it find?
Well, for trips downtown, the travel times were pretty comparable. But for inter-neighborhood trips, the kind women often make for caregiving or accessing local services, public transport was significantly longer, largely due to transfer costs and waiting times.
And the underlying reason for this gap in planning?
Often it comes down to, well, assumptions. An assumption of universal needs, perhaps based on a traditional male commuter pattern, and sometimes a perception that women's travel patterns are just more complicated or atypical.
Even though they're typical for millions of women.
Precisely, and therefore harder to measure or plan for. But as urban planning experts point out, this perception is simply untrue. Their travel is just different, not inherently more complex.
This male default even influences the design of our homes and public spaces, public housing, for example.
Yeah, often designed with a kind of male breadwinner model in mind, which can have really negative consequences for women.
The Brazilian example was quite telling.
It was. Public housing built without adequate transport links or childcare options nearby. It inadvertently forced women residents, who needed to earn money but couldn't easily commute, into illegal, often precarious, home-based work.
Because the design didn't consider the reality.
Exactly. Their caregiving responsibilities, their likely reliance on public transport, it just wasn't factored in sufficiently.
Vienna offers a fascinating contrast, though.
It does. Their approach to public housing back in the 90s was quite revolutionary for its time. They actively collected data broken down by sex disaggregated data.
And they used that data how?
They used it to prioritize the needs of the future occupants. In one major project, Frauenwerkstatt, they specifically focused on women's needs.
Leading to different designs.
Yes. Things like more communal spaces, safe play areas visible from homes, better lighting, proximity to transport, even layouts that supported care responsibilities like kitchens with clear sight lines to living areas where children might be playing.
It demonstrates the power of actually asking and collecting data, doesn't it?
Intentionality in design. By actively seeking out and incorporating women's needs and perspectives, they created housing that was just more functional and supportive for a huge portion of the population.
Another critical issue highlighted in the sources, shifting slightly, is the feminist issue of inadequate sanitation and the danger of sexual harassment linked to that in public spaces.
Yes, this is hugely important. Studies, for instance, have linked open defecation in India to an increased risk of non-partner sexual violence against women when women have to go out into fields or open areas, especially at night.
They're incredibly vulnerable.
Incredibly. And even when efforts are made to build safe, accessible toilets for women, like the court orders in Bombay mentioned in the sources, progress can be frustratingly slow. Bureaucracy, lack of funding, lack of political will.
And the lack of safe sanitation is a profound example of how gender-insensitive design violates women's fundamental rights, isn't it?
Absolutely. Their right to equal access, their right to safety in public spaces. The fear of sexual harassment, often linked to poor infrastructure like lack of lighting or safe toilets, restricts women's mobility and their ability to participate fully in public life.
The stats on fear are quite stark. Women are twice as likely as men to feel unsafe in public spaces.
That's right. UK studies show significant differences in how men and women perceive danger in everyday places. Car parks, train platforms, bus stops, just walking home after dark.
And sexual harassment itself on public transport is massively underreported.
Hugely. In cities like Washington, D.C., New York, London, Baku, the official statistics likely represent just the tip of the iceberg. Many women feel unable or unwilling to report, perhaps fearing they won't be believed or that nothing will be done. It speaks to a normalization of fear for women.
The sources share some harrowing examples, like the Delhi gang rape case on a bus,
which tragically brought international attention to this issue and led to initiatives like the Safe City crowd mapping platform,
where women can anonymously report incidents of harassment.
Yes, which is valuable for raising awareness and identifying hotspots. But as the sources stress, these citizen-led initiatives aren't a substitute for systematic professional data collection by urban planners and transport authorities.
And that kind of sustained data collection is often lacking.
Often, yes. Funding gets cut, priorities shift. The closure of databases like GenderSite in the UK, which track gender issues in urban planning, underscores the ongoing challenge. Without consistent data broken down by sex, it's incredibly difficult to design truly equitable and safe cities for everyone.
Okay, let's turn to the world of work, both paid and unpaid. The default male has significant implications here, too.
Immense implications. The 1975 women's strike in Iceland is such a powerful demonstration of this.
Correct. Where 90% of women walked out of their jobs and homes for a day.
Yes. It brought the country to a standstill and powerfully highlighted the immense value of the unpaid work, childcare, housework, emotional labor that women disproportionately perform. Work that keeps society running, but is often invisible and uncompensated.
And studies consistently show this imbalance, right? Across the globe.
Consistently. Whether it's scientists in the U.S. or populations in India, Italy, France.
Yeah.
Women do a significantly larger share of unpaid work, even when they also work full-time in paid jobs.
And this unequal distribution has consequences.
Profound consequences for women's mental and physical health. Studies have linked having fewer paid working hours, often due to shouldering care duties, to deteriorating mental health in women.
And what about overtime?
Alarmingly, research from Sweden and the U.S. found that moderate overtime actually increased hospitalization and mortality rates for women while having a protective effect for men.
Wow, a protective effect for men, but harmful for women. Why?
The hypothesis is often linked back to that double burden. Men doing overtime might just be doing overtime. Women doing overtime are often still doing the bulk of the unpaid work at home on top of that.
The sources shared that anecdote about the male boss. Completely oblivious.
Ah, yes, the one whose female colleague pointed out she was her own full-time wife at home, juggling everything herself.
It really highlights how the traditional workplace is often designed for this mythical, unencumbered worker, doesn't it?
Exactly. Someone without significant caregiving responsibilities who can dedicate themselves fully to the paid job because someone else traditionally assumed to be a wife is handling everything else.
And women often accommodate these responsibilities by taking part-time work.
Which leads to lower pay, fewer benefits, career stagnation, underemployment. It's a huge factor in the gender pay gap. This assumption of the unencumbered worker is a fundamental flaw in so many workplace structures.
Even seemingly gender-neutral policies can end up disproportionately benefiting men, can't they?
Absolutely. The sources give examples like Australia's pension tax concessions or the UK's auto-enrollment pension scheme.
How does the UK one work against women?
It has a £10,000 earnings threshold per job. Because women are more likely to be in low-paid work or have multiple part-time jobs that each fall below that threshold, they are disproportionately excluded from being automatically enrolled and benefiting from employer contributions.
Even though their total earnings might be above £10,000 if they have several jobs.
Exactly. The policy structure, while not explicitly discriminatory, doesn't account for women's more typical, often fragmented employment patterns. It fails to recognize their more interrupted career paths.
And even well-intentioned family-friendly policies can backfire. The university tenure example.
Right. Giving an extra year on the tenure clock per child, intended to help parents, right?
Seems reasonable.
But studies found it actually benefited men more than women.
How could that happen?
Because on average, women were still the ones primarily using that extra year.
Where a portion of the parental leave is specifically reserved for the father and is lost if he doesn't take it.
Yes. These policies have significantly increased male involvement in childcare. When the incentive is there and the leave is non-transferable, fathers are much more likely to take it.
And this has positive impacts on mothers' future earnings, too.
Yes, studies in Sweden showed that for every month of leave the father took, the mother's future earnings increased. It helps level the playing field both at home and at work.
These policies really show that change is possible with the right structures.
But they do. They challenge that unencumbered worker norm.
The sources even share that tiny anecdote about a male colleague's expense code.
The one that implicitly assumed he had a wife at home handling certain domestic tasks that might otherwise be expensed.
Yeah, it's those small, everyday assumptions, isn't it? They really highlight how ingrained this default male thinking is.
They absolutely do. These seemingly minor details reveal the pervasive underlying assumptions that shape our systems and processes, often without us even consciously realizing it.
Okay, let's talk tech. The tech industry often prides itself on being a meritocracy, right? Data-driven.
That's the image. Yes, pure talent and hard work succeed.
But the sources point out the irony. Because despite this reliance on data, there's a clear, well-documented gender imbalance. Women are significantly underrepresented, especially in leadership.
And the sources suggest that men in the industry might simply not notice this imbalance. Again, it's the male default, potentially shaping their own perceptions.
If your group is the norm, you don't see the disparity as easily.
Exactly. When the dominant group is the standard, disparities can become invisible to those within that group. And the belief in meritocracy, while laudable in principle, can end up masking underlying biases when the playing field isn't actually level.
And this bias even creeps into artificial intelligence.
Oh, definitely. We're seeing more and more evidence of this. Image data sets used to train AI can be biased. Think soap dispensers not recognizing darker skin, or image searches for CEO returning overwhelmingly male pictures.
And translation software, too.
Yes, defaulting to male pronouns even when the original language is gender neutral. Google Translate, translating a gender-neutral Turkish sentence about a doctor into "he is a doctor" in English, for instance.
That's concerning, especially as AI becomes more integrated into our lives.
It's very concerning. If the data AI is trained on, or the algorithms themselves reflect existing societal biases, they risk perpetuating and even amplifying those biases on a massive scale.
There are also worries about algorithms guiding hiring decisions, aren't there? CV screening, video interview analysis.
Yes, and a real lack of transparency about how these algorithms are designed. Do they account for potential gender bias in the historical hiring data they might be trained on? Or do they just learn to replicate past patterns?
And without transparency, it's hard to know or fix it.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult to assess and address potential biases, raising huge questions about accountability and fairness in automated decision-making.
And when it comes to consumer electronics for women, the sources were quite critical.
Yes, critiquing a lack of genuine innovation. Often the focus is just on aesthetics making something pink, rather than solving actual problems women face.
Which has even led to outdated technology in medical devices for women.
The breast pump example is given, often based on decades-old technology, uncomfortable, inefficient. And linked to that is the lack of mandated, private, appropriate spaces for pumping at work in many places.
It suggests a broader undervaluing of women's experiences and needs.
It certainly seems that way. A lack of investment and innovation in technologies specifically designed for women's health and well-being.
And this is compounded by the reluctance to back female-led tech companies.
Yes, due to stereotypes and the predominantly male venture capital landscape. The phrase "men back men" comes up.
Even though the sources point out that backing women-led companies is actually a good investment.
Statistically, yes. Diverse teams and companies targeting underserved markets often perform very well, but overcoming those biases in the investment community is a major hurdle.
The story of Tanea Bowler and her company Elvie really illustrated this, didn't it? And the data gap itself.
It really did. Her experience trying to develop a pelvic floor trainer highlighted the profound lack of basic scientific data on the female body itself. Even something as fundamental as detailed vaginal anatomy wasn't as well researched as you expect.
That's quite shocking, a lack of basic anatomical data.
It underscores the depth of the gender data gap in science and medicine, which has huge implications for women's health.
And this lack of gender analysis extends even to things like fall detection technology for the elderly.
Yes, despite evidence that women and men tend to fall differently. Different causes, different types of falls, different injury patterns.
So one-size-fits-all approach might not work.
It might lead to less effective devices for older women, who are actually often at a higher risk of falls and fall-related injuries. Failing to consider these gender-specific factors is a real oversight.
Which brings us squarely to a critical area, the male body as the medical default.
The absolute core of the problem in healthcare.
The sources explain how the medical system historically just assumed minimal difference between male and female bodies, beyond the obvious size and reproductive differences.
Right. Leading to this focus on the typical 70-kilogram man as the standard for research, for drug dosages, for understanding disease.
And women's experiences, when they differed, were labeled atypical.
Exactly. This historical bias has had profound and lasting consequences for women's healthcare. Medical education often presented the male body as the norm, female physiology as a variation. It led to a fundamental misunderstanding of women's health.
And this resulted in the continued underrepresentation of women in medical research.
Shockingly so. Even in trials for drugs specifically aimed at women, like the so-called female Viagra mentioned in your sources, the number of female participants could be incredibly low compared to men.
And a routine failure to even analyze or present data by sex.
Yes. In many medical publications, even in FDA records sometimes, The lack of sex disaggregated data broken down for males and females separately, is a major obstacle. How can we understand how diseases affect men and women differently, or develop targeted treatments, without that basic data?
The deadly consequences are particularly snark with heart attacks, as we touched on earlier.
Absolutely. Women being 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed, often because their symptoms, stomach pain, nausea, fatigue, are deemed atypical.
Even though they are typical symptoms for women.
Precisely. And there's often a lack of awareness, even among physicians, that cardiovascular disease is actually the leading killer of women, not just men.
And standard diagnostic tests are less conclusive in women.
Yes, things like ECGs. And normal thresholds for biomarkers, like troponin, might actually be too high for women, meaning their heart attacks could be missed. There's an urgent need for female-specific biomarkers and diagnostic approaches.
Furthermore, the sources discuss how women's pain in general is often dismissed.
Dismissed as emotional, psychosomatic, all in their head.
Leading to misdiagnosis or being prescribed antidepressants instead of actual pain medication.
Yes. This connects to the idea of Yentl syndrome, the concept that women's health issues are only taken seriously when they present exactly like men's.
And conditions that are more prevalent in women, like irritable bowel syndrome or migraines,
are often poorly understood, under-researched, and sometimes trivialized, precisely because they don't fit the male default model of disease. The dismissal of women's pain reflects a deep-seated gender bias.
Okay, let's look at the economic impact. The default male has consequences here too, ones that are often overlooked.
Big time. GDP calculations, for instance. The standard measure of a country's economic output.
What's the issue there?
They completely fail to account for unpaid household services, childcare, elder care, cooking, cleaning. All that essential work, mostly done by women, isn't counted.
Even though it has huge economic value?
Immense value. Estimates suggest it could represent a substantial portion of GDP if it were counted maybe 20–40% or even more in some countries. Excluding it creates a massive gender data gap in our understanding of economic productivity and contribution.
And this exclusion also affects women's ability to participate in paid work, doesn't it?
Directly. Women who are primary carers are much more likely to have to reduce their paid work hours or quit their jobs altogether compared to male carers.
And high childcare costs are a major barrier.
A huge financial disincentive for mothers returning to work, particularly in countries with less public support, like the UK and the US are often cited. The cost of childcare can eat up such a large portion of a woman's potential earnings, especially in lower-paid jobs, that it barely seems worth it financially.
Whereas places with subsidized childcare see a positive impact.
Yes, the example of Quebec is often used. When they introduced heavily subsidized childcare, women's workforce participation increased significantly. It shows that affordable childcare is not just a social issue, it's a major economic lever.
Now, there's that statistic you sometimes hear. 70% of those living in poverty are women. The sources debunk this.
They do. While women certainly face higher risks of poverty in many situations, that specific 70% figure is apparently inaccurate and not well supported by reliable, globally comparable, sex disaggregated data. Definitions of poverty vary. Data is patchy. It's a reminder to be critical of statistics that sound too neat, especially when the underlying data is weak.
Good point. Accurate data matters. Even tax systems can have unintended gendered effects.
Yes, even in OECD countries that might be actively trying to reduce the gender pay gap through other means. Many tax systems, especially those based on household income or with allowances skewed towards a primary earner, can effectively increase the financial disincentive for a secondary earner, usually the woman, to work more hours or return to work.
So they don't account for gender dynamics within the family.
Often not adequately, no. And similarly, benefits designed with a male default in mind, perhaps assuming a continuous work history, can end up coming at women's expense by effectively increasing their unpaid care work burden if they don't qualify easily.
The UK Women's Budget Group analysis mentioned in the sources often highlights this, right? How austerity cuts or tax giveaways disproportionately impact women.
Exactly. They analyze fiscal policy through a gender lens and frequently find that measures appearing gender neutral on the surface have significantly different impacts on men and women due to underlying economic inequalities and differing social roles.
Okay, finally, let's consider women in politics. Does having more women in power actually make a difference?
The sources say yes, absolutely. There's tangible evidence. Research shows, for example, a correlation between higher female political representation in urban areas and increased likelihood of girls completing primary education.
So women politicians prioritize different things sometimes.
They can bring different perspectives and lived experiences. leading to policy outcomes that better reflect the needs of the entire population, not just half of it.
There is that comment from Bernie Sanders mention about not voting for someone just because they're a woman.
Yes, and the sources challenge that framing. They argue the real problem isn't people voting for women because they are women, but rather people being less likely to vote for a woman due to ingrained biases.
Biases about female ambition specifically.
Exactly. The perception of female ambition in politics as somehow unladylike or overly aggressive. Women are often judged more harshly than men for displaying the same levels of assertiveness needed to succeed in that environment.
It's disheartening that even research on gender and social exclusion sometimes suffers from this data gap, failing to break down its own findings by gender.
It is ironic, isn't it? A real blind spot sometimes.
And while measures like all women shortlists, AWS, have been effective in boosting female representation in the UK Parliament,
Dramatically effective in the seats where they were used.
the government decided not to extend their legality.
That's correct, which raises concerns about future progress towards gender parity in Parliament. And representation in local government, despite devolution, is often even worse.
And just getting elected isn't the end of the story, is it? Women face barriers within political settings, too.
Definitely. Exclusion from informal, often male-dominated patronage networks and decision-making spaces. The old boys club kind of thing.
And being interrupted more often.
Yes, famously highlighted in the Trump versus Clinton debates, but studies show it's a common phenomenon. These systemic barriers can significantly limit women's ability to exercise influence even once they are elected.
Tragically, the abuse and harassment faced by female politicians is also a huge factor.
A massive deterrent. Online abuse, threats, sometimes physical intimidation. It discourages women from running for office in the first place across many countries. UK, Australia, Nigeria are mentioned.
Are there mechanisms to deal with this?
Some countries, like Bolivia, have tried to legislate specifically against political violence and harassment targeting women. But generally, the sources suggest a lack of formal procedures within parliaments themselves for addressing sexism and misogyny effectively.
Okay, briefly touching on a couple more areas mentioned.
Yeah.
Conflict and displacement.
Yes, the point here is that a supposedly gender-neutral approach in humanitarian aid or refugee camp design often fails women badly.
How so?
Women and girls face significantly increased risks of sexual violence in these settings. Their specific needs, like safe, private, sex-segregated, and lockable toilets and washing facilities, are absolutely crucial for safety, but often aren't adequately provided or enforced.
Failing to consider these gender-specific vulnerabilities has devastating consequences.
It really does. The sources mention women in camps resorting to desperate measures. Walking in groups, forming protection circles, deliberately not going to the toilet at night, even restricting food and water intake, or wearing adult nappies to avoid having to use unsafe facilities.
And homelessness, too, another area with a data gap.
Yes. Standard measures of homelessness, often based on counts of rough sleepers or people using shelters, tend to undercount women.
Why is that?
Because women experiencing homelessness are more likely to be in less visible situations, staying in domestic violence shelters, sofa surfing, engaging in precarious living arrangements like sex for rent. Traditional counts often miss these hidden populations.
So a lot of concerning examples across the board. But it's not all bleak. The sources end on a more hopeful note.
They do, highlighting that women are increasingly leading the way in actually closing the gender data gap, both in research and in politics.
How?
Studies with more female authors are apparently more likely to include gender analysis. And we see female politicians actively championing women's health issues, sometimes across party lines, like the examples given of UK MP Paula Sherriff on mesh implants, or the 2 Republican senators who opposed repealing Obamacare, partly due to its impact on women's health care.
So increased representation is starting to make a difference in tackling the data gap itself.
It seems to be a positive sign, yes. More women in research, more women in politics. It's crucial for driving forward the collection and use of sex-disaggregated data and advocating for policies that genuinely address women's specific needs and realities.
So to sum up this deep dive then, the core takeaway seems really clear. This pervasive default male in how we collect data, how we design things, how we see the world. It's created a world that just doesn't equally serve everyone.
Not by a long shot. And the consequences are significant, as we've seen, across pretty much every aspect of life: safety, health, economic opportunity, political representation.
And it's vital to remember, as we said at the start, that while this bias is often unintentional, baked into systems over centuries, its real-world impacts are undeniable.
Absolutely. We've seen how it manifests in everything from car crashes and heart attack diagnoses to, snow clearing strategies and workplace pension policies. It's everywhere once you start looking.
We hope this deep dive has given everyone listening a clearer understanding of this really fundamental issue. Maybe start considering how the default male might be influencing things in your own field or areas you're interested in. Start looking for those often invisible biases in the data you encounter, the designs you use, the assumptions you hear every day. Why should you care? Well, because recognizing these biases is the absolutely essential first step towards building a more equitable world.
Which leads us to a final thought, perhaps. Recognizing the gender data gap is that first crucial step towards creating a more equitable and, frankly, more truly human-centered world. So what small change, informed by a broader, more inclusive perspective, could you maybe advocate for today in your own sphere?